Last week, the White House signed off on something that didn't make front-page headlines, but might change Africa's political landscape for years. With one stroke, President Trump ended decades of U.S. financial aid and security support across the continent. There was no grand speech, no dramatic television moment, just a cold, bureaucratic order dressed up in talk of efficiency and burden sharing. The United States quietly closed the tap on money, guarantees, and even its modest boots on African soil. For many, this wasn't just another policy shift. It was a signal that Trump is done trying to maintain America's old role in Africa. But if he thinks this is a clever move to save money and refocus resources at home, he might be underestimating what's slipping away. Because while Trump may believe he's cutting costs, the reality is he's also cutting influence. And in today's competitive world, that's a lot more expensive. Over the years, America's presence in Africa has been messy but significant. A handful of military outposts, training camps, and intelligence sharing operations dotted across dozens of countries. Billions in aid flowed through programs to fight disease, build infrastructure, or support fragile democracies. The arrangement wasn't always smooth. It came with strings, suspicions, and plenty of bureaucracy. But it kept the U.S. in the room. Now, that room is changing, and America is slipping out the door just as new players are stepping in. China is laying down rail lines and power grids. Russia is dispatching military advisors. Gulf countries are buying up farmland and ports. Even Turkey is striking defense deals that would have been unthinkable a decade ago. In the meantime, Trump's administration has decided to pull back, assuming Africa will wait for the U.S. to return. But the world isn't standing still. In fact, Africa has been shifting for a while. Countries like Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger have started to rewrite the rules. Instead of leaning on American security guarantees, they're exploring new partnerships, sometimes with countries Washington once warned them against. Russia's presence is growing where American drones used to patrol. Local armies that once depended on U.S. TAP advisors are now experimenting with regional alliances or simply deciding to go it alone. Trump's team framed this withdrawal as common sense. Let African nations handle their own problems. Stop spending U.S. tax dollars on faraway battles. Focus on home. On paper, it's a logical cost-saving strategy. But the overlooked truth is that influence isn't free. It's paid for through exactly those ties Trump is severing. By pulling out, he's not just saving money, he's surrendering space. And in geopolitics, empty space never stays empty for long. For decades, America managed to keep a foot in Africa's door. It didn't always lead the conversation, but it had enough leverage to nudge things when needed. A training program here, a hospital project there, quiet intelligence support that kept fragile states from collapse. That network built goodwill, sometimes thin, sometimes fragile, but there. Now with Trump's quiet pullback, those threads are snapping, and the alternatives are already rushing in. In Niger, the U.S. once ran a critical drone base out of Agadez, tracking insurgent movements across the Sahel. When Niger's leadership began reconsidering its military ties and the U.S. started packing up, there was no panic in the presidential palace. Instead, Niger's generals began talking more seriously with Moscow. They started asking if the years of American assistance had ever truly made them safer. It's an uncomfortable question for Washington, because the honest answer is often no. Meanwhile, in places like Ghana and Kenya, leaders aren't staging protests over America's exit. They're simply pivoting. Ghana is deepening its relationship with China. Kenya is expanding trade links with Gulf nations. South Africa, a longtime U.S. partner, is doubling down on its ties within BRICS, not out of animosity, but practicality. They're hedging their bets in a world where Washington is becoming less predictable. Trump, of course, frames this all as toughness. He likes to say, America won't be taken advantage of anymore. But there's a fine line between refusing to be used and making yourself irrelevant. By stepping back, the U.S. has left a vacuum that others are more than happy to fill, often with fewer questions asked, fewer human rights lectures delivered, and far simpler contracts signed. There's a deeper irony here. Trump believed that by threatening to leave, he would force African nations to beg him to stay, to offer up concessions just to keep American aid and troops nearby. In reality, Africa didn't flinch. The panic Trump expected never arrived. No emergency summits, no desperate letters from African presidents pleading for help. Instead, there was largely silence, not out of satisfaction, but indifference. Africa adjusted, and that indifference is telling, because it suggests that even before Trump's decision, the US had already begun losing its grip. Decades of partial promises, tangled bureaucracies, and shifting priorities had worn thin. African leaders learned the hard way that American support could disappear with the next election cycle. Now, Trump's policy has simply confirmed what many suspected: Washington's commitments aren't built to last. So here we are, with Trump proudly declaring he's trimmed America's overseas obligations, thinking he's scored a political win back home. But in Africa, what's playing out is a quiet, profound realignment. The US isn't being rejected, it's being replaced, and that's not something you can reverse with a tweet or a campaign speech. The fallout from Trump's retreat isn't immediate chaos. It's something more subtle, and for America, potentially more dangerous. It's the quiet realization across African capitals that Washington is no longer the indispensable partner it once claimed to be. And that realization is reshaping alliances in ways Trump never planned for. Take Burkina Faso. Just a few years ago, it was a fragile state leaning heavily on both France and the US to help counter insurgencies that kept pushing deeper into its borders. But over time, frustration grew. French troops were accused of overstaying without delivering real security. US advisors were helpful but slow, bound by layers of approvals from Washington that didn't match the urgency on the ground. When the Burkinabe military finally decided to chart its own course, it wasn't a chaotic break. It was an orderly eviction. They told French forces to leave, adjusted their posture with the US, and welcomed Russian military consultants. It was a clear message: we'll find support, but on our terms. That same logic is echoing across the Sahel. Mali and Niger have made similar pivots, building what they now call the Alliance of Sahel States. It's not a puppet block for Russia or China. It's an assertion of independence, a move to set up security frameworks that don't rely on Western approval. This doesn't mean these countries have suddenly become stable or safe. They still face immense threats from extremists and internal divisions. But what's changed is their willingness to gamble on alternative partnerships rather than cling to unreliable Western guarantees. Trump's inner circle often spins this as burden shifting, that he's forcing African governments to take responsibility for their own security. But the truth is, many of these nations always knew they'd have to fend for themselves eventually. Trump didn't teach them self-reliance. He just accelerated their timeline by proving how quickly American support could vanish. The outcome isn't stronger Western influence, it's a continent exploring every option but the old one. Even in countries not directly in the line of insurgency, the geopolitical recalibration is obvious. Ethiopia has built vast infrastructure networks using Chinese loans, yet it fiercely guards its sovereignty, refusing to let Beijing dictate internal politics. In Senegal, you see modern Gulf-funded industrial zones rising alongside older European partnerships. South Africa's ties with BRICS aren't about ideological loyalty, they're about bargaining power. They play multiple sides because they can, and because the US is no longer offering anything uniquely indispensable. That's what makes this moment so consequential. Trump seems to believe stepping back is a show of American strength, a flex that will make the world come calling. But Africa didn't knock on the door. It simply moved on, stitching together a patchwork of new relationships. And many of these new deals come with fewer lectures. Where the US likes to attach conditions about governance, human rights, or democratic reforms, competitors like Russia or the Gulf states don't bother. They bring cash, weapons, or infrastructure with fewer questions. The more complex truth is that Africa is not naively jumping into anyone's arms. Leaders there are well aware of the strings attached to Chinese finance financing or Russian arms deals. What's different now is their leverage. Because with America stepping out, they have more room to maneuver. They're playing Beijing against Moscow, Gulf investors against European banks, even regional blocs against one another to secure the best deals. This isn't chaos, it's sophisticated survival. It's Africa learning to navigate a crowded geopolitical marketplace. Meanwhile, the US is on the outside, watching its long-claimed sphere of influence slip away. Trump may say this is a smart way to cut costs, to stop subsidizing security for others. But that narrow view misses the strategic point. America's investment in Africa was never just charity. It was a way to maintain global relevance, keep rivals at bay, and ensure markets and alliances that served American interests. Now, by retreating, Washington has traded short-term savings for long-term vulnerability. Because the real consequence of Trump's withdrawal isn't that Africa collapses, it's that Africa reorganizes, without the US at the center. Security deals are still being signed, roads and ports still being built, trade routes still expanding. They're just happening with different partners. And once new supply chains, military arrangements, and diplomatic habits set in, they're hard to reverse. It also means the US will find it tougher to intervene later if a crisis spills over. With fewer bases, fewer local contacts, and less goodwill, any future American administration looking to reassert influence will face a steeper climb. The Pentagon used to boast about how American forces in Africa could respond quickly to threats. Now, with Trump's policy changes, those networks have thinned. Local militaries and politicians are adapting, often by welcoming advisors from Moscow or striking investment pacts with the Emirates. There's also the reputational hit to consider. Across the continent, people aren't blind to how Washington's focus waxes and wanes with its election cycles. Obama talked partnership, Trump pulled back, Biden tried to rebuild ties, and Trump's second term has swung the pendulum again. That inconsistency tells African leaders they need to secure their futures without counting on American follow-through. So they are, and the damage isn't only among presidents and ministers. African youth, who make up more than half the population, see how Washington behaves. They're tuned into local media, social channels, and Pan-African discussions that frame the US as a power past its prime, more interested in lecturing than listening. That's not just a narrative problem, it's a shift in perception that undercuts America's soft power for a generation. Trump thought pulling troops and cutting aid would show American strength. Instead, it's revealing America's shrinking influence. And in boardrooms and cabinet meetings from Accra to Addis Ababa, that realization is driving a quiet but profound change. Africa no longer waits for Washington to lead. By now, even Trump's closest policy advisors must sense it. Africa isn't pausing to see if the US comes back. It's forging ahead, building a new diplomatic and economic landscape where Washington is just one option among many, often not even the first. That's a long way from the old days when American officials could set the tone for security briefings, or when a presidential phone call could steer regional decisions. Those days are fading, and Trump's retreat has only sped them up. Consider how things are shifting on the ground. In West Africa, the newly formed Alliance of Sahel States isn't just a desperate reaction to terrorism, it's a statement. These countries, long dependent on external donors, are now pooling their own limited resources, coordinating military strategy without waiting for NATO or AFRICOM plans. They're talking openly about security doctrines that exclude traditional Western partners. That's not just autonomy, it's a pivot to a future where the US plays a supporting role at best. Meanwhile, in East Africa, massive infrastructure corridors are taking shape, connecting ports and inland cities with roads and railways funded by Gulf banks and Chinese companies. These aren't speculative projects anymore. They're pouring concrete, laying track, opening special economic zones, and they're doing it without a Western blueprint. In southern Africa, nations are striking mining deals that bypass Western extraction models. Instead of allowing multinationals to cart off raw minerals under lopsided contracts, they're negotiating processing partnerships that keep more value at home. Again, no one's waiting on Washington. Even North Africa is evolving its own strategy. Mediterranean dialogues are increasingly focused on Europe as a market, not on America as a security guarantor. From Cairo to Casablanca, the calculus is about trade flows, energy diversification, and regional hedges against both Western and Eastern shocks. The US still matters, but not in the commanding way it once did. That's why Trump's disengagement isn't just a matter of cutting costs, it's a strategic gamble that's paying dividends for rivals. Where America has pulled back, Russia has found openings to offer cheap weapons and political backing with minimal scrutiny. China has doubled down on long-term infrastructure bets that lock in decades of influence. Even mid-tier players like Turkey, India, and the Gulf states are seizing contracts, bases, and cultural footprints once assumed to belong to Washington. And through it all, something else is taking root that most American think tanks underestimated: African agency. The old assumption was that Africa would always be a passive chessboard, waiting to be carved up by stronger powers, but that view is crumbling. African leaders today are more transactional, more strategic, and frankly more cynical. They're leveraging competing suitors to drive better terms, sometimes playing Beijing against Moscow or Riyadh against Brussels. They're not naive. They know foreign interests are still foreign interests. The most striking shift might be cultural. African media isn't waiting on Western outlets to tell its stories. Pan-African networks, local influencers, and digital communities are reframing debates about sovereignty, resources, and identity. In Accra, or Johannesburg, or Bamako, young people aren't primarily consuming US headlines. They're watching regional podcasts, WhatsApp clips, and local YouTube channels discussing how to take control of African futures without asking Washington for permission. That's the environment Trump's foreign policy now faces. By pulling out abruptly, by cutting aid and shuttering partnerships without offering credible alternatives, he didn't just save America money, he spent America's standing. The world didn't stop. Africa didn't collapse. It adapted. And now any future U.S. administration hoping to regain lost ground will find the terrain far less forgiving. Because here's the final irony. The U.S. still has enormous strengths: unmatched universities, a dynamic economy, cultural soft power that can't be replicated overnight. But none of that matters if trust is gone. If African governments believe that American support can vanish with the next election cycle, swept aside by a new president chasing domestic applause, they'll keep building fallback plans. And that means fewer exclusive deals, fewer reliable votes at the UN, and far less diplomatic deference. It also means more long-term uncertainty for Washington. A world where Africa feels equally at ease signing security pacts with Moscow, rail agreements with Beijing, tech pilots with Delhi, and agricultural corridors with the Gulf is a world where America no longer sets the rules. That's not because Africa is anti-American, it's because Africa is pro-Africa and finally acting like it. So in the end, Trump's policy isn't just a story about Africa. It's a story about how quickly global influence can slip away. While Washington congratulates itself for trimming foreign obligations, it's also discovering that irrelevance costs more than any aid program ever did. And maybe that's the biggest geopolitical lesson from all of this. In the 21st century, power isn't only about who has the biggest military or the deepest pockets. It's about who shows up, who listens, who earns trust, and who sticks around when it's not convenient. Right now, Africa is drawing up its own plans, with or without the United States, and that may be the most important quiet revolution happening anywhere in the world.